few franchises that have gone through quite as much change as Resident Evil, grandfather of the survival horror genre, perfecting the third-person shooter and trying out every possible idea that fell into their laps. Capcom are nothing if not thorough when it comes to getting the most out of Biohazard. And so ranking them needs to be thorough as well, so I've got my stars beret, a few cans of first aid spray, and a rocket launcher handy for the end boss. Let's not dilly-dally as the night is long and full of monsters and demons. I'm Sai for WhatCulture.com, and this is every Resident Evil game ranked from worst to best. Number 29, Umbrella Corps. I don't think it's particularly surprising that The Time That Resident Evil Tried to Be Call of Duty is appearing at the bottom of this list. That isn't even facetious. The devs said they were inspired by Western esports shooters. However, as will become apparent with these early entries, Capcom never really puts all of its eggs into these kinds of baskets. Umbrella Corps is no different, feeling like the lousiest, most half-assed shooter you've ever played with a few Resident Evil elements slapped on top. The single-player story is paper-thin, which means the game has to get by on the merits of its meritless gameplay. Utter frustrating tripe. It's almost so bad that it didn't make the list, as the words Resident Evil aren't actually in the title, but we shouldn't forget how bad things can get. Number 28, Resident Evil Survivor 2 Code Veronica. The Survivor series is a weird mishmash of things, including 2 original stories, a Dino Crisis spin-off, yes really, and Survivor 2, which is a retelling of the then recent Code Veronica. It was originally designed for arcades but got a PS2 port in Europe and Japan, but not America, which possibly says a lot about how worthwhile it is. It basically drags and drops the first-person mode of Code Veronica into its own standalone game, turning the story into a series of timed missions, and then gives it awful controls and a messy UI. Somehow worse than Steve Burnside's bad voice acting, this game has none at all. The dialogue is silent and poorly translated, and its story is a truncated dream sequence version of Code Veronica. Ironically, since the game is a dream sequence, you'd probably have more fun dreaming about Code Veronica than playing this arcade dumpster fire. Number 27, Resident Evil RE-verse. Resident Evil and multiplayer are a contentious prospect, however RE-verse could have really had something. With 25 years of classic characters and monsters to pull from, an online shooter that sees players taking each other on in iconic locations and then transforming into a BOW to hunt down their aggressor is actually a solid concept. It was first revealed with basically that in mind, but then shuffled out in a way that was clear Capcom were ashamed of it after a year and a half of delays. And even after all this time, RE-verse has 3 maps, 1 game type, and half of its cast are made up of the generic soldier goons that hang out with Chris in Resident Evil Village. There was hardly an attempt made to celebrate Resident Evil's wider history, and instead the game just poorly reuses assets. When the servers of RE-verse get switched off, not a single soul will care, as the game is a constant reminder of what could have been. Number 26, Resident Evil Dead Aim. Back to the Survivor series now, and Resident Evil Dead Aim might be the most peculiar of a peculiar bunch. Released during the PS2 era, where Capcom were really trying to figure out Resident Evil's next steps, it's an odd combination of third-person exploration and first-person action. The problem is that the formats don't mix at all, and the wide gangways of the good ship Spencer Rain aren't stopping you from basically sprinting past almost every encounter. Which is fine, because there's not a lot of fun to be had in engaging in combat anyway. The game's janky polygonal protagonist, Bruce McGivern, is hard on the eyes and dumb as rocks, the story is uneventful, and largely the game has little aesthetic merit. There's a weird charm to Dead Aim's experimental style, and it's not the thing many developers would even dream of releasing nowadays, but there's really not a lot of reason to play this. Number 25, Resident Evil Operation Raccoon City. Developed by Slant 6 Games of SOCOM fame and then dropped in the same calendar year as Resident Evil 6 and Revelations, the forgettable Operation Raccoon City is never going to win any awards. Largely billed as non-canonical, which didn't do it any favours, it takes a what-if approach to the Raccoon City saga. The marketing example of this is what if you killed Leon S. Kennedy, because that's a question Capcom apparently decided its fans wanted an answer to. The real what if of Orc is what if we turned Resident Evil into a squad-based shooter and then rushed it out to release. There's an insincerity to the game that's hard to shake, as outside of some unique encounters with classic heroes and monsters, it doesn't really use the IP very well at all. The gameplay is about as baseline as you can get for the genre without slipping into truly terrible territory, so it's quick dumb fun with a friend or 3, but it's not going to be many people's favourite entry in the Raccoon City era. Number 24, Resident Evil 6. In order to survive irrelevance, Resident Evil has transformed over the years. Resi 6 sits as an interesting crosshair of being a game that acted as a crescendo to the action era of the series, and being so derided that it necessitated another era entirely. Resident Evil 6 is an infamous mess of explosions and quick-time events. The set pieces are next level over the top, and even in a series known for its transformative nature, there's very little Resi DNA in here as it tries so hard to be everything at once. What's worse is the dull sense of inevitability. The storyline goes around in a big circle, hemming and hawing about a Neo umbrella, killing off interesting new threats early and hinging on a tired plot point about clones. What good it did, i.e. bring back classic character Sherry Birkin all grown up, is lost amidst the incoherence of it all. Fun in short bursts? Maybe, but most players won't have the patience to sit through its engorged 20-hour campaign, and really, who can blame them? Number 23, Resident Evil Resistance. Capcom have never been shy about throwing their IPs at any new or popular idea to see what sticks. Sometimes you get great successes like RE7's VR mode, and other times you get something like Resident Evil 4 on the Zeebo. Resident Evil Resistance is a clear reaction to the trend of 4v1 asymmetrical titles, and in particular the success of Dead by Daylight. Now, in the game's defense, it does have a lot of cool ideas. Instead of hunting players around the map on foot, the solo player acts as a demented overseer, triggering traps, spawning monsters, and, well, yes, hunting players around the map on foot, but in the size 18 boots of the Nemesis and the Tyrant, trying to stop the survivors from solving puzzles and escaping. Like previously, Resistance's true failing was a lack of support. Like they're afraid of the water, Capcom dip their toe into a multiplayer idea and then run screaming that the water is wet. The new content added in maps, skins, and characters was good, but short-lived, leaving Resistance a troubled combination of broken and shallow. Number 22, Resident Evil The Mercenaries 3D. You'll be as happy to hear as I am to say it that this is the last multiplayer title on this list for quite a while, and thankfully you can look at Mercenaries 3D in an overall positive light. Taking basically everything from the addictive Mercenary side games in RE4 and 5 and adding in the missing character of Claire Redfield, this is the kind of game that Capcom could do with making now. A single player or co-op zombie blaster. Mercs 3D even adds in some really cool quality of life tweaks to the existing formula, like the option of first-person aiming and, in a rarity for the series, firing whilst moving. Even with this, it feels a little low on content, and its 30 missions of monster clear-up do get repetitive. It takes advantage of the 3DS's 3D and dual screens, but it's hard not to wonder how much better it could have been if released on home consoles. Number 21, Resident Evil The DARKSIDE Chronicles. The DARKSIDE Chronicles is the second in a pair of on-rails side games released for the Nintendo Wii. Taking full advantage of the system's motion controls, players will aim their various weapons at enemies both obvious and obscure, as well as shake their knife wildly at incoming attacks. Retelling the events of RE2 and Code Veronica results in a mixed bag, but the main event is the original story set before RE4. Operation Javier is only really mildly interesting for the diehard, but whilst it might not land with everyone, it at least offers a unique location in the black market havens of South America. DARKSIDE Chronicles' biggest failing is the inclusion of a constant vomit vision screen shaking effect. No matter how far into the game you are, it's blindsiding, constantly ruining any possible tone and arresting you of any real feeling of skill as you constantly struggle to get your bearings. It's basically like trying to play a motion-controlled Resident Evil game while sat in a massage chair that's trying to kill you, so funnily enough, it's the lesser of the two titles based on this alone. Number 20, Resident Evil Gaiden. Quite possibly the longest-running black sheep of the series, it might be surprising to see Resident Evil Gaiden so far up. The first Resi handheld game, Gaiden released for the Game Boy Color in 2001 after an experiment porting the first game to the system, which proved impossible. As such, this original tale needed to come at things from a very different angle. Combining Metal Gear style exploration and, of all things, rhythm-based battles, Gaiden should be commended for its vision. It's an incredibly bold affair, and whilst its gameplay is a big departure, it manages to keep a tense tone by having the enemies constantly shuffle towards you as you try to time your attacks. Of course, it's got issues with a very limited save system, a lack of solid puzzles, gameplay that doesn't evolve much over the running time, and some 8-bit music that could be considered grating. Still, it's an odd curio that should be praised for its boldness rather than derided for its constraints. Number 19, Resident Evil Survivor. Speaking of weird and debatably wonderful, the first spin-off in the entire series, 2000's Resident Evil Survivor, fulfills the original game's early concept as a first-person action game. Sadly, releasing at the end of the PS1's lifespan, it's aged in a lot of places. The controls are awkward, the game has a certain amount of jank, and the voice acting is atrocious, although in its own way, that's a positive.
Stop performing those terrible crimes and just come back home.
That is hilarious. When it's not being unintentionally funny though, Survivor has some of the darkest story beats in the franchise's entire history. Notes tell of child kidnapping and brain surgery, as well as a mass escape and execution at a private prison, and the game's crescendo reaches the production plant of the dreaded Tyrant. You face down many of the big bald buggers alongside hunters, lickers, zombie dogs, crocodiles, etc. Survivor is short but extremely replayable thanks to its many routes, which can result in 3 different lead villains of a sort. Like Gaiden, Survivor is easy to love for its attempts to be much better than it could have ever hoped to have been. Number 18, Resident Evil Zero. Resident Evil Zero is a spooky little prequel that delves into the dark history of Umbrella. On top of the inner conspiracies of the company's top brass out to get each other, its tone is helped by a deeply eerie soundtrack and truly some of the best visuals in the series. The problem is it's let down by some major flaws, including a ridiculous villain better fit for a fantasy game and an enemy list that relies very heavily on insectoids and not much else. Whilst Resi's fixed camera and tank control style was starting to tire with a wider gaming audience, Resident Evil Zero at least tries new things. However, what is meant to refresh the experience only bogs it down. The worst offender is the removal of the series staple bottomless item boxes. This forces gamers to drop important weapons and items around the map and then spend forever running back to find them later when the game unexpectedly tells them they're suddenly necessary again. If gamers thought the classic style felt cumbersome before, Zero goes to a whole new low. Number 17, Resident Evil The Umbrella Chronicles. Unlike DARKSIDE Chronicles, The Umbrella Chronicles isn't a gigantic nausea simulator, so that's a big plus. More than this, its original content is a touch more interesting as it tells the tales of lots of interconnected tissue. For example, how did Wesker escape the mansion before it exploded? How did Rebecca get from the events of Zero to RE1? It's a wonderful reason to revisit these locations, and the game does reuse old assets but from a totally new perspective. Unfortunately, it isn't all great. Aside from retelling Zero and RE1, Capcom also chose to include something that is named Resident Evil 3 but barely resembles it, as it instead reuses locations from Outbreak to save time. Additionally, the game's overarching Russian supervillain and his cloned techno tyrant are just a step too far into silly. Still, if you fancy a different way to trudge around the Spencer Mansion and training facility, this is a pleasant, all guns blazing way to do it. Number 16 and number 15, Resident Evil Outbreak and Outbreak File 2. I'll be honest, this was perhaps the hardest entry to place. Pairing the Outbreak games up together was a no-brainer since they are very similar, with the sequel just nailing a few minor things a bit better. However, in a true your mileage may vary moment, it's a story of two halves, online versus offline. Outbreak consists of 8 of Raccoon City's hopeful survivors making their way through 5 distinct locations and is often called way ahead of its time for a reason. Internet connectivity in consoles was still in its infancy in 2004, the PS2 wasn't even built with it in mind, and no one knew quite what they were doing. For gamers that couldn't get online, they were left with a pair of discs that didn't fulfill their potential. Dreadful AI and long load times make the experience tiresome. However, thanks to the wonderful fan community around Outbreak, it's possible to play the games how they were supposed to be. Throw in modern advancements of a group Discord call, since the games lack native voice chat, and the effectiveness of it is truly shocking. Working with friends to tackle enemies and solve puzzles, often splitting into groups to beat each scenario's time demands, can be incredibly rewarding. It's a game that thrives on players interacting, feeling out the title, and bettering themselves over multiple playthroughs. So Outbreak and File 2 have to sit lower than one would like, simply as there's no official way to get the online experience anymore, but there's a very good reason it's considered the hidden gem that fans constantly call for a return to. Number 14, Resident Evil 5. In the background, Resident Evil 5 adds tons to the series lore as we get an insight into the ancient origins of the T-virus. Meanwhile, bioterror becomes an international threat. The series is evolving, for better or worse, true to the story and the gameplay. For positives, RE5 remains one of the prettiest games in the series. It features one of the most memorable starring roles with Roger Craig Smith's take on Chris Redfield. And quite simply, it's fun. Gameplay is smooth and fluid, yet keeps enemy encounters tense as hordes of Magini can often overwhelm Chris and new partner Sheva. The words Resident Evil and co-op action shooter felt like oil and water at the time, but it really works wonders. It's a shame then that, like Outbreak before it, a solo playthrough feels so much lesser. The AI system is atrocious and results in a dim-witted partner who feels more like a hindrance than a friend, squandering key resources. It also relies too heavily on trying to ape the smash hit success of RE4, even outright copying sequences. Then again, it did also spawn the boulder punching memes, so maybe I'm being too harsh. Number 13, Resident Evil Revelations. Now, the Resident Evil franchise from the outside might look daunting with its 25 years of history, interconnected lore pieces, and several remakes and retellings to muddy the waters, but the overall series, however, is somehow less complicated than the plot of Resident Evil Revelations by itself. With double, triple, quadruple crosses happening every other chapter and lots of confusing conspiracies, Revelations takes its concept of an American action thriller drama TV show a bit too far. Still, despite being another game set on a boat, it manages to be refreshing. It's got its own standalone story with a large new cast of characters alongside Chris and Jill and a unique tone. Where the numbered entries were delving deep into the action, Revelations pulls back a bit to be a slower, more deliberate experience with terrifying bloated sea monsters and themes of betrayal and mystery which certainly feel like they harken way back to the first game. It overstays its welcome and the complex plot doesn't help, but its gameplay and design are both solid, which is extra impressive when you consider that it was first released as a Nintendo 3DS exclusive. Number 12, Resident Evil 3 2020. Get those angry comments ready as I'm about to defend the most recent punching bag of the franchise. But let's address the issues first. What harms RE3 Remake is that all the best parts of the original are noticeably missing. The different possible routes through the events of Raccoon City are now just a linear mission, and Nemesis' presence is almost totally absent. With the iconic Stalker reduced to just a few mere boss fights, the game is unrecognisable to some fans. It's not much of a remake, but that doesn't mean it's a bad reimagining. Instead of judging it on its own merits, RE3R often gets unfairly compared to the gigantic success of RE2R. Its punchiness is used against it, but at least it doesn't waste your time with 4 scenarios that feature almost every single set piece over and over looking at you, RE2 Remake. The highlights of Resident Evil 3 are the continued strong characterization from the previous installments, as the game features one of the series' best interpretations of Jill Valentine and a much needed revamp for Carlos Oliveira. The more action-oriented slant with a reactive dodge and parry made it feel pleasantly different from Remake 2, but coming just over a year after meant that it felt shy of finding enough of its own identity. Number 11, Resident Evil Code Veronica. Resident Evil Code Veronica was released in 2000 exclusively for the Dreamcast before being later re-released with additional scenes as Code Veronica X. Despite its naming connection making it sound like a side game, this title is a linchpin in Resi's story. It pairs up the Redfield siblings, reintroduces Wesker, and sets up events for future titles. For these reasons, it's become a game that many fans desire to get the remake treatment, and it's hard to disagree with this point, especially because it's also a game with a lot of issues that could be cleared up. The game suffers with padding due to excessive backtracking. The move from totally pre-rendered to 3D backgrounds has left Code Veronica looking washed out and in need of a new coat of paint. And of course, some of its vocal performances, like shrieking Steve Burnside, are better left in the past. But otherwise, Code Veronica has some of the most chilling and tragic figures in the series in the villainous twins of the Ashfords and their unfortunate father, an unbelievably good soundtrack, and the ability to play in first or third person way before the likes of Village and RE4 Remake's upcoming VR mode. As the first step away from the PlayStation 1, it was a good indication that Resident Evil was capable of so much more growth than people originally expected. Number 10, Resident Evil 1996. In 1996, there was nothing like it, even if the voice acting might seem clunky and hilarious and the live-action opening preposterous. Resident Evil blew minds for daring to dream big. Whether in spite of its cheesiness or in fact because of it, Resident Evil still terrified back on the PS1. Instead of losing itself in the clear desire to be as cinematic as it could, Resident Evil's developers also knew how to best take advantage of what it actually was, a video game. Diaries from vanished workers left to be discovered tie the player's gameplay to the plot. Loading screens become moments of tension as a new door creaks open. You have safety in the save room, but you must venture out to find ink ribbons in order to make those saves. Resident Evil didn't just lay the groundwork for survival horror, it was a masterstroke of games design. The title is packed with memorable puzzles, a huge roster of enemies, and a mystery that begs to be solved. Nowadays it seems quaint, clunky, and improved upon elsewhere in almost every way, right? Well, the original RE still has some of the most open-ended exploration in the series, with one-time events that take place depending on your route or action. It also gave us the wonder that is Barry Burton, so how could it not be in the top 10? Number 9, Resident Evil Revelations 2. Speaking of the bearded legend himself, after nearly 20 years, Mr. Burton finally gets a true starring role in a big-budget Resi game. The gameplay of Revelations 2 leans a tad away from its predecessor's hub world and instead takes place as a series of episodes on an oppressed island. Still, it retains the horror by making its new cast members more vulnerable. The entire game is based on co-op play, so whilst it's a decent time flying solo, Rev 2 really rewards pairs of gamers who want to play asymmetrically, with one providing a puzzle-solving, item-gathering support role to the other. It's a neat concept used to great effect throughout the story, and after RE6 was a sign that the series still had horror somewhere in its veins. If nothing else, when it didn't land perfectly, it was at least a darn sight more interesting than just copying what everyone else was doing. Additionally, it's just a refined piece of work, perhaps the pinnacle of the third-person gameplay up until that point. Revelations 2's additional raid mode was a blast of addictive POW battling mayhem. Number 8, Resident Evil 3 Nemesis. As the last of Resi's mainline PS1 titles, Resident Evil 3 is a fantastic demonstration of nailing a formula. Aside from some of the best character models and pre-rendered backgrounds of the franchise, the gameplay feels tighter than ever, bolting on a quick dodge and gunpowder for ammo crafting. As Jill Valentine, you felt like you had a handle on the situation more than ever before, which made it the perfect time to introduce the Nemesis. This unstoppable stalker was as scary hidden in the shadows somewhere as he was running at you, winding up a big old punch to the back of your head. Where RE3 loses points is more of an unfortunate set of circumstances. The game was originally designed as a side game, and it shows. It's shorter despite its more open-ended exploration, and there's a lack of truly noteworthy new enemies and almost no boss fights. But aside these minor quibbles, and regardless of its original billing, it sends off the classic trilogy with the perfect swan song. It gave us a greater and perhaps the most definitive look at what Raccoon City was like in its dying days, delivering an emotional punch as the city finally burned amidst your last escape. Superb. Number 7, Resident Evil Village. Resident Evil Village is the latest chronological entry in the franchise and continues where RE7, still to come, left off. Ethan Winters has to survive the titular village as he faces off against the Four Lords, Mother Miranda, and a bunch of Lycans. Werewolves in Resident Evil? Well, surprisingly, it works. On that note, the game improves on 7's failings with a more varied enemy roster and an evolving hub world between each of the game's major story locations. The village itself might be the star of the game, as it expands every time the player returns to it and invites them to hunt for more collectibles and upgrades. Taking notes from RE4, the game's weapon upgrade system meshes wonderfully with the increased focus on action. Unfortunately, the story loses itself in the latter half with terrible leaps of logic and magician-level pseudoscience, as well as the action getting dangerously close to RE6 levels of nutty. However, the title at least has one of the scariest sequences in the franchise early on when you're chased down by a deformed fetus. Only in horror games can you say that as a positive. Number 6, Resident Evil 4 2023. Remaking one of the most influential games of all time is a gargantuan task, yet 2023's Resident Evil 4 is thankfully up to it. The remake faithfully captures what made the original so great, having hordes overwhelming Leon but juggling it with a strong roster of weapons to push back against the Ganados. The game introduces a parry mechanic, meaning you can block all manner of attacks, but it degrades your knife over time, adding new layers of strategy and tension. One of the major overhauls is the presentation. Rendered beautifully in the RE engine, Remake 4 is gorgeous, detailed, and tweaks the atmosphere to keep it in line with RE2 and RE3 Remake. It's still plenty silly at times, but tonally it slots into place after the Raccoon City saga easier than the very intentional departure of the original. Though the remake isn't a game changer like its source material was, it still deserves recognition for perfectly translating it for a modern audience and crafting a Moorish gameplay experience. This could have gone horribly wrong, and somehow RE4 is in the conversation for Game of the Year 2023, and rightfully deserved. Number 5, Resident Evil 7 Biohazard. We've already seen over the years that the franchise toyed with first-person perspectives here and there, but it never got it quite right until Resident Evil 7. And it couldn't have come at a better time. After the industry collectively pointed and laughed at Resident Evil 6, the series needed to refresh itself or face extinction. Resident Evil 7 Biohazard successfully reignited the franchise and returned to the survival horror route in ways both obvious and subtle. As newbie Ethan Winters, players have to look for their wife Mia while encountering the deadly Baker family, who perhaps aren't as welcoming as they think they are. 7 made Resident Evil scary again, whilst also retaining some B-movie schlock like the chainsaw duel with Jack Baker. Like any other great game in the series, it starts out slow and progressively turns into Ethan Winters' one-man army. The creepy, puzzle-filled Baker estate is one of the most flawlessly realised settings in the series, brought to life gorgeously in the first outing for the RE engine. It also amped up the fright and thrills in virtual reality, becoming pretty much the selling point of PSVR. RE7 is such a return to form that even its few issues like linear progression can't stop it from ranking amongst the best. Number 4, Resident Evil 2 2019. If Resident Evil 7 was the spark, then RE2 Remake was the flame. The number of Mr. X memes in the week of release alone just said how huge it was. Classic characters appear more lifelike than ever, continuing RE7's fantastic writing and setting a new standard that all other remakes would follow. The RPD might well be the most iconic location in the series, and it is treated with the reverence it deserves here. It feels like a real and thoroughly dangerous place, capturing light and opulence as well as dark, wet and stormy. Not only is the RPD scary again, so are the slow lumbering zombies within it as they lurch unpredictably and eat through your ammo without a worry in the world. There might be some issues with copy and pasted scenarios and storyline beats that feel a little rushed, but nothing can really leave a mark on those pure first experiences with the game that feel like Resident Evil should. I want to play this, but I'm so terrified that I also kind of don't. Incredible care was clearly taken to put fear and horror into the third-person over-the-shoulder style of Resident Evil in a way that had never been done before. Number 3, Resident Evil 2002. 2002's remake of Resident Evil is a quintessential entry in the series and captures what made the original great. Even just 6 years on from the PS1 game, it was a huge improvement. The title's pre-rendered backgrounds are stunning, with the Spencer Mansion looking atmospheric even 20 years on. As with all games of this type, it means more work can be put into the character models. As such, Chris, Jill, Wesker, as well as the zombies, hunters and giant spiders and so on still look great. And that really says it all. The original Resident Evil has an incredible list of memorable characters and enemies, and these might be the archetypal versions of all of them. Whilst some fans may lament the removal of the goofy dialogue for a more serious tone, it's easy to forgive as you get lost in a more complex version of the haunted abode, hunted by deadly crimson heads that won't stay down, and sharing in the tragic horror of the new Lisa Trevor side story. To those who want a way to try out the classic RE style of gameplay that isn't too dated, then Resident Evil Remake is a high recommendation. The HD remaster even includes a new control scheme. Either way, it's tough to argue that this is not the game that defines Resident Evil's identity the best, even after all this time. Number 2, Resident Evil 4 2005. Resident Evil 4 changed the course of the series forever as it shifted towards a more action horror approach. To freshen things up and take a few risks, the game is suddenly an over-the-shoulder action shooter set in rural Europe, facing down a horde of parasite-infested farmers. To accommodate this, RE4 doesn't necessarily totally depart from horror, but instead changes its kind of scares. It's no longer about chills, it's now about panic. The opening village is a statement of intent regarding the number of enemies coming at the player, the importance of being aware of your surroundings and juggling combat possibilities. Who knew panic could be so fun? Despite Resident Evil 4 being a massive game compared to its younger siblings, clocking in at around 15 hours, it's just so simply addictive. This is helped by the big list of weapons in the merchant's shop, offering all kinds of ways to mow through the game's vast roster of enemies. Though not every aspect of Resident Evil 4 has aged well, like the quick time events and the escort sections, its impact on the video game industry even exceeds what the first game did back in 1996. And number 1, Resident Evil 2 1998. Compared to the quaint little spooky Spencer mansion from 1996's Resident Evil, the jump to Resident Evil 2 was massive. In just 2 years, Capcom managed to take the experimental survival horror formula and almost perfect it on their second try. It looked jaw-dropping, its soundtrack is still one of gaming's best, and it's a game that the series continually references back to. Resident Evil 2 makes the gameplay sturdier, adds in some more bite from the weapons, introduces a bunch of new iconic enemies and characters by surprisingly avoiding any returning names, and constructs a brilliant new labyrinth in the RPD. More than this, it was an early indicator of where video game storytelling and visual direction was going, that it could tell tales that rivaled cinema. RE2 features all manner of interesting stories from the end times of Raccoon City, like Leon and Ada's first meeting, the disarray of the Birkin family and the G-virus-obsessed William, the US government's collusion with Umbrella and the corrupt police chief. RE2's plot is a constantly unfolding puzzle box that brilliantly keeps players coming back for more with its 4 overlapping and interconnected playthroughs, a system that has somehow never been taken full advantage of again, not even in the remake. And whilst the remake may be a brilliant modernisation, Resident Evil 2 OG was the sequel the series needed to cement its legacy. It remains one of the best games on the PlayStation 1 and the best entry in the franchise. I love talking about Resident Evil, and if you got this far, you probably love hearing about Resident Evil. So either now or very shortly, a video is about to appear on screen, so you can stay with us at WhatCulture Gaming and hear more Resident Evil takes. Speaking of takes, I want to hear yours. What are your favourite games in the series? What are your least favourite games in the series? This list is kind of a combination of my own opinions as well as the general wider theory, and also some stuff from the original writer that I wanted to sort of retain. But you can check out the written version of this article, which is quite different at this point, over at whatculture.com. Make sure you like this video and subscribe. I've been Si for WhatCulture, and have a good week.